The next thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to set up, configure, and secure those externally accessible services. So in this case, because I'm running a web server in SSH, that's going to be Apache2 and the SSH daemon. How I actually go about doing this depends on the service. We already covered in previous videos common vulnerabilities that are associated with the services that you're likely to see. So I would go back to that specific video and learn more about that service. In this case, I'm just going to work with SSH and Apache2. So first, taking a look at SSH, if I go to etc SSH, I'm going to edit some of the configuration options in sshd config. So first of all, we don't want to allow root to log in through SSH. So I'm going to either comment this out, or I can explicitly set it to no. I'm going to set this to no here. The other thing is, let's say we know that our scoring user, in this case Jay Rice, is authenticating using public key authentication. In that case, I want to make sure that public key authentication is enabled, but that password authentication is disabled. So if I go here and see password authentication, I'm going to set this to no. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to write that out. The next thing is I'm probably going to need to make sure that Jay Rice's public key, SSH key is actually in the authorized keys file. I'm not going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to assume that I've already added his public key to the authorized keys file. And since I made changes to a configuration in SSH, again, I'm going to have to do system control, restart SSH. The next thing I'm going to take a look at is Apache2. And like I talked about before, there are so many different web attacks that it's very hard to actually go in and hunt for all the different web attacks in any reasonable amount of time. But there are a couple different tricks I can do. So if I go to var www.html, which is my web root directory by default, I can see what sorts of files are here, and I could go ahead and kind of investigate those files. You might have a ton of files, and so that might not be worth your time, but there are some searches I can do. So for example, I know what common PHP backdoors look like, and I know I'm running PHP. So in PHP, attackers can use functions like system or shell exec or exec to run system commands in PHP. And a lot of these backdoors that attackers use rely on those functions. So I can actually use grep-horn again to recursively search the contents of the files in this directory and look for something like system. And I'm including this parenthesis just to limit what I'm finding to the actual use of that system function here. So if I try that and I check out this directory, I don't see anything. I can also try shell exec. And in this case, we do actually see one file that has shell exec in it. So that's rather suspicious. So then I'd want to go check out what that file is actually doing. We'll actually look at this file in a second. So I'm not going to do that right now, but I want to cover some other things first. Another thing you could actually do is you could disable these potentially dangerous PHP functions like system and shell exec. You can actually disable that in your PHP configuration. I'm not going to go into how to do that. That's kind of like a stretch goal for you if you want to look into it. One possibly easier way of doing that is by adding a htaccess file. And in that htaccess file, you can add different PHP configurations. And there's one that's like disable functions or something like that. And then you can specify which functions you want to disable. But again, I'm not going to do that. Another way that I can search for things like backdoors that Red Team potentially added is by looking at when my files were modified. So it's quite likely that first the website was developed and set up, and then Red Team had the chance to go in and edit the website and add their own backdoors. So any files that have been modified more recently are likely to have been modified by Red Team. So I can sort files by how recently they have been modified. And I can do that with find. So if I say find and I say dot for the current directory, that's just going to get all the files in the current directory. And then I'm going to print some information about them. So I'm going to use printf. The information I'm going to print here is going to be %t@. So that's going to get the last time that they were modified. I'm going to add a space just for visual appeal. And then I'm going to say %p. And %p is going to print the path to that file. So if I do this, you see this prints out all of the files here. And then the last thing I'm going to want to do actually before I show that, I'm going to add \n to the end of it so it actually prints each one on a new line. Because otherwise this is kind of hard to figure out what's going on. All right, now if we take a look at this, you'll notice that it printed out these files, and in addition, it printed out this timestamp for when the file was last modified. We can then sort these timestamps by piping this into the sort command. And I'm actually going to sort this in reverse order, so we see the files that were most recently modified first. And so if we look at the files that were most recently modified, we see this htaccess.php. So while this isn't very useful in this case, because we only had 2 files to look through, if you have a ton of different files in this directory and you have to look through a bunch of them, this can be super useful to give you an idea of which files Red Team might have potentially modified because they were the last files to be modified, right? And then I can go and take a look at those files. So now I'm going to actually take a look at htaccess.php. And we can see that this is just basically a reverse shell here. So it's using shell exec to spawn a reverse shell with netcat. So I'm pretty sure that this is malicious. And if you're not entirely sure, again, make a backup of it. So I can perhaps copy this to my root directory, right? But because I am sure that this is malicious, I have 2 options. I can either remove that line from the file. So I can say Control K and then save out that file. And now that line is no longer there. Alternatively, I can remove the file entirely with rm. Along with this, there are all sorts of configuration options that a Red Team could abuse, especially with Apache and with PHP. So for example, they could create a malicious PHP extension or get one off GitHub. They could create a malicious Apache module. So if you're familiar with how we install things in Apache, like PHP, which has to interface with Apache, they're installed as modules. So Red Team could create a malicious module. They could have modified our configuration. So there's actually a configuration in PHP, and it's called auto prepend file and auto append file. When that configuration is set, then any file that gets read on your web server automatically has additional stuff that's added to it, either at the beginning with auto prepend file or to the end with auto append file. Another thing they could do is, so var www.html is our main web directory, but they could have added an additional directory where they put some other file that's not var www.html. So all sorts of things that Red Team can do, but the one thing that all these things have in common is that they require editing these configuration files. And so I'm just going to dig through these configuration files really quick and see what I can find. And for the sake of this video, I actually went to ChatGPT and I said, hey, ChatGPT, give me every possible configuration file for PHP and Apache. And it came up with a really cool list. So I'm just going to go through that list. The first one is if we go to etc PHP. Our version is 8.2, so I'll go to this 8.2 directory here. And we're using the Apache2 version of PHP, or, you know, Apache is running PHP, so I'm going to go to Apache2. And if I look here, I have this php.ini main configuration file, and I have additional configuration files in the conf.d directory. So I can take a look at php.ini and see what's set up here. I'm just going through it really quick. Most of this stuff looks like it's commented out, so I'm not seeing anything that's uncommented here. But if there is something that's uncommented here, I might want to dig into it and see what it does. Again, if I see any one of those auto prepend file or auto append file, that could potentially be interesting. I'm not seeing anything super interesting here. And you can go through this whole file. Of course, this file is really, really long, so it's kind of a trade-off how much time you want to spend going through all of this. You could also, I'm sure you could do some magic to get rid of lines that start with that semicolon. We could probably do that with grep. So if I say something like cat php.ini, and we're just going to use grep, we'll say egrep, and then we can use regular expressions. So we're going to take lines that start with, and hopefully it doesn't treat semicolon as a special character. And then we're going to do -n just to, or sorry, -v just to remove those lines. And boom, now we're seeing all the lines that don't start with semicolon, and I can use more to dig through that. And maybe this is going to be a lot easier to look through than the file originally was with all those commented lines. I think we got through all of it already there. So all sorts of little tricks you can do. And then if I go to the conf.d directory, you'll see we have a ton of files here. So maybe I don't want to go through all of them. Actually, I think these are going to be mostly related to PHP extensions. So if I print out, for example, 20 ftp.ini, you'll notice it just loads that FTP extension. So there's actually not much to dig through with these files. I can do something like cat the current directory, and I'm actually going to print out all the files in the current directory at once with this wildcard. So now I can look through all of this at once, and I can again filter out any commented lines. So I can say grep dash, or whatever I did before, egrep dash v, and we're going to filter out any lines that start with that semicolon. Boom. This is a lot easier to look through. So now if I look through this with more, pretty cool. We were able to look through it all just like that. So all sorts of little tricks you can do to kind of speed up the process of reading configuration files. The next place I'm going to check is the actual Apache configuration files. So if I go to etc Apache2, I believe, and I list what's there, I can look through my main Apache2.conf file, so Apache2.conf, see if there's anything unusual there. I could do a similar trick that I did before and remove any lines that start with a hashtag, right? Then we have this include optional, so it's including conf enabled and sites enabled. So we're going to go to conf enabled to look for additional configurations, see what's here. We have some ones, we can dig through them. Then we can go to sites enabled. And we just have this default configuration file here. If I dig through this, this is where we'd see other document routes. So other places where there could be web files other than just var www.html. So it's worth going, this file especially is worth going through manually and taking a look at it. Because if you find another directory, then you definitely want to check out what's in that directory as well. Because Red Team could have potentially put a backdoor file in that directory. We also have, we can go to mods enabled. If I go to mods enabled, of course, Red Team could create their own custom module, or they can affect how one of these modules is working. So I'm not going to take the time to go through all of these. You could certainly go through all of these if you're being thorough. It's kind of a trade-off how thorough you want to be versus how quickly you want to get this done. So kind of up to you how you want to approach that. The other thing that I would check out really quickly here is htaccess. So if I go to my any web directories, so like var www.html here, if I list out hidden files, there is no .htaccess file, but sometimes there is a .htaccess file here, and that allows you to configure additional things about how how that directory is treated. So if I just create .htaccess, I'll just show you how, if it's there, I can actually search for it. So .htaccess doesn't just have to be in that root directory, it can be in subdirectories as well. So I can look for any .htaccess files with find. I'll search this current directory, and I'll look for any file named .htaccess. And now you'll see all the places where that .htaccess file is located. So in this case, it's just located here. But if it were in a subdirectory, it would show me that. And then I can go ahead and take a look at that as well. So I can nano.htaccess and see how that's configured. So all sorts of things we can look at. And that's kind of the problem with securing Apache2 and PHP, is there are so many ways that red team could mess with it and that red team could backdoor it. So for something like this is where monitoring is going to be especially important. So we're really going to want to take a look at that access log and see what sorts of, how red team is interacting with our Apache service and what sorts of requests they're sending. And maybe that'll give us a better clue as to how this is misconfigured, and maybe we'll be able to kind of in real time do a little bit of that battling against red team and finding those vulnerabilities and fixing them.